Hello, Chaffinland. We are now looking at trade in Europe. So let's make sure we have our guided notes, something to write with. We're ready to go because we're getting started now. All right, so our standards are that we need to be able to analyze different economic systems. We need to analyze the benefits of and barriers to voluntary trade in Europe. And we need to describe factors that influence economic growth and examine their presence or absence in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Russia. So let's start with trade. Because every country does not use the same type of money, international trade requires a system for exchanging currencies between countries. The European Union, which is a group of countries that have banded together to help their economies, they simplified currency exchange among their member countries when it established the euro as the common currency. All of the countries do not have to use the euro. They can use the euro if they choose. This one common currency has made trade and travel much easier within Europe. So, for instance, the United Kingdom is no longer a part of the EU. They left. This was a famous thing called Brexit, which we will talk about. But they did not use the euro. They used their own British pound, their currency. They did not use the euro. But a lot of countries have chosen to use the euro. All right, let's talk about trade barriers and what those are. So countries sometimes set up trade barriers to restrict trade because they want to produce and sell their own goods. Now that sounds counterproductive, but they want to sell their own things. So let me give you some examples real quick, and then we're going to keep going. So here in Chaffinland, you are familiar with my Disney dancing flowers. So if that's what we were producing in Chaffinland and we were selling them, and let's say that across the ocean in Hibergia, they started making, we're going to say Star Wars or planetary dancing somethings, okay? Not flowers maybe, but somethings. They started making those and they were selling them, but they were making them cheaper. We might want people to buy our dancing flowers because we were producing them, and we wouldn't want people to buy things from Hibergia, so we might have to set up some barriers. So one barrier is a tariff, a tax placed on imported goods. So again, let me say that in the case of Chaffinland and Hibergia, that we are making and producing Disney dancing flowers, we're selling them and it's going well, and they start exporting from their country and we're importing into ours their dancing whatevers, and people are wanting to buy those because they're less expensive, and that's causing a problem for us with selling the things we have in our own country. And so we might place a tax on those things that were coming into our country from Hibergia so that it would cost more for people and people would be more likely to buy our goods. Because if a tax is placed on it, then the country who's sending it in this case Hibergia, it's going to cost them more to send it to us, and so they're going to then charge more for their goods. And we'll look at some details about that in a minute. Now, a quota is a restriction on the amount of a good that can be imported. Now, some of you may have heard of quotas, and it's like you want to get at least this much. In this case, it's a restriction. It is you can only send this much. You're not allowed to send any more. So back to the Chaffinland and Hibergia example. So we've placed the tariff on them, and they're still managing to sell them for cheaper than we can sell ours. And so we're like, no, we really want people to buy our goods. So we would put a quota on it. We say you can only send 200,000 a month to Chaffinland, and that's it. And so we would put a quota on them. And then the third trade barrier is an embargo. And an embargo is that you stop all trade with another country. So let's say, again, we put the tariff on the goods from Hibergia and they were still selling more than we were. And then we put a quota on them, like you can't send too many in. And they obeyed that quota for a while, but then they started kind of sneaking around and getting some more in somehow. And so they weren't really going along with the rules that we had put in place. And so we might have to say, well, that's it. We're not going to trade with you at all anymore. So when there's a tariff, when there's that tax, then that means that there's going to be a higher price on the imports, which means there's going to be a lower demand for those imports because they're going to have to pay more. And then there will be a higher demand on domestic goods. Now remember that domestic in this case means within the country. Now the European Union, the EU, was primarily established to set up free trade among the countries in Europe. Now remember that free trade does not mean that it doesn't cost anybody anything. It just means that there aren't these trade barriers. So products produced in Europe can now move freely without tariffs to other EU member nations. They don't do that with each other. And this free trade leads to huge cost savings for European consumers and businesses. All right, so a quota, if there's a restriction on the number of things, then there becomes a supply shortage. There's not as many of them there, which would lead to a higher price on the imports. So there's a supply shortage in the imports, which equals a higher price on the imports, which would mean, again, a higher demand for domestic goods, for things from within the country. Now, in order to protect its members, the EU sometimes establishes quotas on trade with other nations and within the EU. And here are some examples. So the EU places quotas on clothing imports from China when EU members, certain countries with strong textile industries, strong clothing manufacturing industries, complained about cheap import prices. They're like, they can make them really cheap and we can't. And so we don't like that, so they put a quota. The EU strictly limits the amount of fish a boat can bring to port in order to give EU countries equal fishing advantage. So if you are a country who has a lot of coastline where you could fish, you don't want other countries sending in a bunch of fish because you would like to handle that yourself. Okay, so turn to a neighbor and discuss 1 to 2 benefits of being a European Union member nation and 1 possible disadvantage to being a European Union nation. And all of this is in terms of trade. So our final trade barrier is embargoes. That means there's no trade at all. The U.S. has a long-standing, and we will talk about this later in the year, but a long-standing embargo against Cuba. We'll talk about why and all of that. Now, the EU will embargo imports from foreign countries if that country doesn't follow specific quota rules, kind of like I said with Hibergia. If they wouldn't follow our quota rules, and I think they probably would, but if they wouldn't, then we might have to embargo. Embargoes are sometimes put in place for safety reasons. For example, an embargo against African fish products due to unsanitary water conditions. If the water is not clean, the fish will not be healthy or safe. And the EU may also embargo imports from countries for political reasons. So they might do it use an embargo against a country that violates its citizens' human rights. They might say, we don't want to support that. So in short, the EU has eliminated tariffs to increase free trade among its member nations, so they don't use tariffs. They do use quotas to protect their member nations from other countries and sometimes from each other. And they do use embargoes to protect its member nations and to punish other countries for political reasons. All right, so think, pair, share. So think about it, talk to a neighbor, and then we're going to share with the class. What is the MVP, or most valuable point, about trade in Europe that we've heard? That does it. Go back and view the video if you need to, and feel free to ask questions that will aid your understanding. And remember, always, you are seen, you are known, you are cared for, and you are loved.